So how do we measure poverty? Knowing all of these things that affect poverty, how do we measure them in Mexico? Well, we measure them in various dimensions. And these are the 7 dimensions Coneval uses to measure the amount of people living in poverty. You need quality education, you need quality health, you need to actually be able to find work and that you actually have social security, which is a huge problem in Mexico. You need to eat correctly because malnutrition is something that really affects kids when they're in elementary school developing. You need to have a dignified house. And what I mean by a dignified house is that it has a concrete floor in the sense that you're not standing on dirt, that you're not passing cold, that you have like water and certain like different services like electricity, a heating, some form of heating. That in general you are able to live in a healthy environment without too much pollution, because that also affects different things. And obviously there's no discrimination, because that can always affect your development, because you don't get all the access to all the opportunities you would like to have or you could potentially have if the playing field was much more level. So all of these 7 things are important in order to adequately measure poverty. And this multidimensional way of measuring poverty is not something that many countries do. If you go to like the World Bank data and like in general different indexes to measure poverty and stuff like that, a lot of them just focus on the income side of things. The idea of like how many people are below the poverty line or below $1, or whatever the measurement you want to place. But that is a very incomplete way of measuring. And suddenly you see like, oh my God, Mexico has like 40-something% poor people. That's a lot of people. And similar countries, in sense that they're more or less in our stage of development, have a much smaller poverty percentage. But when you actually measure it with all of these dimensions, they are not that different from Mexico. It's just that they're just measuring the income side of things, and that is a way of cheating the data. So we are actually measuring it correctly. That allows us to know who are vulnerable, who can be affected by different things that will potentially make them fall into poverty. And that is something really new. And what I mean by really new is that not only many countries don't have this, but we did not have this 20 years ago. 20 years ago, when President Fox arrived to power and he won the presidency, and he started in office, they had no idea actually how many people were poor in Mexico. They had vague estimates, because what had happened before is that different governments, federal and state governments, would change the measurement and like how poor the people were for political purposes, to push or further certain agendas against or in favor of certain policies, against or in favor of certain political groups. So it was really hard to actually measure the number of poor people we had. So they created different mechanisms, and in general, the Coneval was created, which is an organism separated from the federal government, that their task was to adequately measure how many poor people we had. And they developed this scale in the sense that in order to measure the number of poor people you have in a country, you need to measure all of these things that we have been discussing. So what you have here right now is a graph in which you have 2 axes. On the one hand, you have the y-axis, the yellow one, that measures money and how much income do people have, income per capita, income per person, basically. And you also have the social rights shortcomings. Basically, what are the different things that poor people lack? Like education, like health, like all of those that are placed in the blue box. All of those are the different shortcomings. And depending on how many shortcomings you have and how much money you earn, you are in the poor area or you're in the extreme poor area of the population or group, I mean. So once you more or less know this, you can adequately measure them. And what has Coneval done over the last 12 years or more, 14 years, is that they actually measure it every 2 years and see how many poor people we have based on this idea. You can decompose this graph into different sections. So you have people below the poverty line. And the most up-to-date poverty line from the July 2020 measurement is 3,217 pesos per month. If a family or a person earns less than that, they are considered poor in Mexico. Um, 3,217 pesos is more or less the minimum wage in Mexico. Basically, if you earn the minimum wage or lower, which should be legal, uh, you're basically considered a poor person in Mexico. But that is in the income side of things. Obviously, there's also the extreme poverty line, which is even worse. Uh, the extreme poverty line is below. As you see, it's 1,600 pesos per month. These are the numbers for the urban areas. Rural areas have other numbers, have actually lower numbers in terms of income. Not that lower, like 100 pesos lower, probably. Not probably. That's a fact. I checked the data yesterday, but it's similar numbers. And what happens is that that is just one component. The other component are all these shortcomings. How many people that actually earn more money than the 3,217 pesos fall into this category, to the vulnerable section of vulnerable population? And that's a lot of people. Think of all the people that probably earn more money, that like have two, three, four, even five minimum wages, but that they don't have social security, or that because they don't have social security, they don't have access to quality, or in general, in theory, quality public health, and they would have to do these like what's called out-of-pocket payments to basically have to pay for like private medicine, private health, which is much more expensive, and that could actually be really harmful to their economic well-being. Or how many of these people actually are not receiving a quality education? Or how many of these people are actually not receiving a nutritious diet, even if they earn three salarios mínimos? So there's a lot of people in Mexico that fall in the big yellow rectangle, that whenever you have some crazy economic thing that happens, and even not that crazy economic things, whenever you have recessions and the economy doesn't grow, like for example last year that it grew negative, it decreased 0.1%, or obviously right now in which you have like a huge crisis, all of those people can really quickly fall into the red rectangle, into the multidimensional poverty. So they're really vulnerable people. The extreme multidimensional poverty is for people that live below the extreme poverty line in terms of income, but that also have three or more shortcomings, that they lack at least three things regarding these basic services and basic social rights. The blue rectangle obviously is people that are a little bit richer and that like don't have any shortcomings. The middle class falls, part of the middle class falls into the blue box. Others from the middle class fall into the yellow box from the left. But obviously, the richer you are, the farther away you are from the red area. Any questions regarding how we measure poverty in Mexico? So before we go to break, I want just to review a couple of graphs that I think show a little bit where we are. So during the last 12 years, we have improved in terms of poverty alleviation, but we certainly have not done enough. As you see from the Coneval measurements, we are the 2018 measurement is basically 42% of the population falls under the poverty line, or in the poverty category. And 7.4% of those people are extreme poor, which is when you translate that into millions, well, that is like 8 to 9 million people in the country are extreme poor. We improved more in the extreme poverty area than in the general poverty area over the last essentially 2 sexennios, but certainly they are not enough. The huge problem of this pandemic is that the economy is going to fall so much this year that the numbers estimated by Coneval that could be the 2020 data point could probably jump that point from 41.9% to something closer to 48 or 49% of the entire population. The huge decrease of our GDP this year, which could potentially be the biggest fall in the last 60 years in terms of GDP, and all the millions of unemployed that can create, essentially could make around, or could generate a situation in which you have around 65 million people poor in the country, which is more or less half of the population. When you think of what poverty means that I just showed you, imagine that 65 million people fall into that category of like either earning less than the minimum wage or the minimum wage, and earning or having different shortcomings. That creates a picture in which it's a terrible picture, and it's really hard to get those people out of poverty. This government and the future governments will have to do a lot to try and pull them together. That is complicated. And also that one of the main problems that poverty creates is that poverty tends to be concentrated among minorities. The minority groups tend to suffer more poverty, and that is really complicated because you see these things in which racism and classism is intertwined with poverty, and that complicates stuff even more, because obviously the most vulnerable groups tend to have or face the harsher problems in any of these economic situations. In this example that I took from directly from the Coneval's website, from this graph, that's why it's in Spanish, the indigenous population is much more, in terms of percentage points, a bigger chunk of the population is poor, rather to the relative non-indigenous people. So obviously, the indigenous people have always fared worse, and they have been abandoned for too many years by the different governments of this country, and that is something that we need to point out. And also, you obviously have the rural-urban divide. Who lives in rural areas? More indigenous people. Who lives in rural areas? Poorer people with less education, with less access to health, with less access to nutritious diets, with less access to like paved roads and like paved or concrete floors, and like in general non-lamina houses. So it's really hard to make it in the rural areas, and that's why too many people migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. The best example of this are probably all the